It's such a great pleasure to welcome you here for this book event. We're so proud and happy that Guy Ziv has produced this wonderful book, Why Hawks Become Doves, Shimon Peres and Foreign Policy Change in Israel. I would like to thank not only the SIS event staff, but also our U.S. Foreign Policy and National Security Program, Phil Brenner and Eric Fillinger, and our Center for Israel Studies team, Michael Brenner and Laura Cutler, and their staff for helping put this all together. We've really enjoyed, I've personally very much enjoyed over the past 3.5 years, the number of events that we've been able to do with the Center for Israel Studies. So very grateful to them for their participation. So Guy Ziv is a professor here in the School of International Service, teaching undergraduate and graduate courses on U.S. foreign policy, the Middle East, and U.S.-Israel relations. He received last year SIS's Outstanding Teacher Award for all his many contributions in the classroom. He focuses his research on foreign policy decision-making, the influence of think tanks on U.S. foreign policy, and the role of political elites in the Arab-Israeli conflict. He's published widely in both peer-reviewed journals as well as a number of newspapers. He makes many media appearances, especially since the subjects of his research interests are often in the news, unfortunately in many cases. In this book, Why Hawks Become Doves, Guy applies insights from cognitive psychology to explain why some leaders are more likely to change their foreign policy orientation than others. And he looks particularly at Shimon Peres, who in his life moved from becoming a hawk to becoming one of the most notable doves, not only in Israel, but in the world. And he drew on a variety of archival sources as well as lots of interviews, including with President Peres. The book has been widely praised by a variety of leading scholars. And in his talk today, he's going to look at how he can apply his findings to current leaders, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is not, I will note, doesn't seem to have yet made the transition from hawk to dove, but I'm sure Guy can tell us more about that. He'll talk about the upcoming elections and prospects for a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I believe we have books for sale outside, so I hope you will avail yourself of the discount that's being provided today for this event. And without further ado, Professor Guy Ziv.
Thank you, Dean Goldgeier, for the nice introduction, and appreciate the plug for the book as well, although I got to say I'm a little concerned about the new Mockingbird by Lee Harper. I hope that's not going to affect my sales. Also want to thank a few other people here before I begin today. I want to thank Phil Brenner and Eric Fillinger of the U.S. Foreign Policy Program, and Michael Brenner, no relation to Phil Brenner, and Laura Cutler of the Center for Israel Studies. Thanks also to Anya Shmiman, Amy Gillespie, Kara Leginis, Ann Deakins, and Paul Johnson, who all worked really hard in promoting this event. And I want to thank also all of you for braving the cold and joining us today, this afternoon, for the book talk / analysis I'm going to provide on the upcoming Israeli elections, which are actually very tied to some of the themes I cover in the book. It's been nearly a year now since the Kerry-brokered peace talks collapsed. And so what are the prospects that Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking will resume following the March 17th elections? If Benjamin Netanyahu is reelected, what are the chances that he will reach out to Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, and that Abbas will be interested? And what's the likelihood that President Obama will want to make such an investment in his remaining time in office? When you look at the current Israeli political map, I think that there are 5 very interesting, very unique phenomena. I call them puzzles that really help to explain the current situation. And for those of you who follow the polls, why the polls are the way they are. They're puzzling, but they become a little clearer once you understand these 5 phenomena. The first phenomena is that we see hawks becoming doves in Israel. Now, we've seen that around the world on a number of occasions in the last 30, 40, 50 years. But in Israel, we see a lot of cases of hawkish individuals who've turned to dovish policies. Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, Ariel Sharon, Ehud Olmert, and Tzipi Livni are among those politicians. Second puzzle is that we're seeing a simultaneous hawkish and dovish shift in Israeli society. So on the one hand, the Israeli electorate has moved in a decidedly right-wing direction over the years. The Likud party is which is the right-wing party, is the largest party in the Knesset. It's been governing the country off and on since 1977. And more Israelis today identify as right-wingers than left or even center or center-left. The new recent surveys find that 55% of Jewish Israelis prefer the right, and only 33% prefer the center-left. Another recent poll finds that 67% of first-time voters define themselves as either right-wing or center-right. And I attribute this trend to a number of different factors. First, demographic shifts. There have been a lot of Jews immigrating to Israel from the former Soviet Union, Jews from France. A lot of them have experienced anti-Semitism, and they tend to identify with the right. The second Intifada also shattered the left and really eroded the trust that a lot of more liberal-leaning Israelis had towards Palestinians. A third reason is the aftermath of the 2005 disengagement from the Gaza Strip. Rather than a more peaceful, Gaza Strip, we have a more violent Gaza Strip, Hamas taking over and shooting rockets into Israel for years now. Fourth is the lack of a charismatic left-of-center political figure. I'm assuming most people in this room have perhaps never even heard of Yitzhak Isaac Herzog, who is the head of the opposition. You have to really be a policy wonk to know his name. And even though he's been around, he's been a politician now for a while. And finally, hostile and inflammatory rhetoric and actions by PA President Abbas, not to mention hostile attitudes towards Israel on the Palestinian street. And so these factors combined help to explain why you have such a right-leaning attitude in Israeli society today. But the reason I call it a puzzle is that despite this right-wing shift, you have a more left-wing shift in terms of attitudes on the core issues. Up until the mid-90s, only the left supported the idea of a two-state solution or a Palestinian state. And up until the 2000s, only the far left supported the idea of dividing Jerusalem. Whereas today, there's a robust debate in Israeli society about such a division. Third puzzle is that socioeconomic issues predominate, yet the Likud party remains in power. So since the social justice protests of 2011, socioeconomic issues have been basically seen as more important, more significant than the traditional political security issues. One poll last month found that 53% of respondents are interested solely in economic matters and plan to vote solely on that basis. Yet the governing party has done very little, admittedly even by some of their own representatives, to change the situation. They don't really focus on socioeconomic issues. And so I attribute the consistent support for the Likud party to two reasons. One is tribalism, this kind of loyalty to the Likud party that's very much ingrained. And secondly, the constituents who are interested in the social justice issue or issue areas tend to split up their vote among a whole host of other parties. So it's not going to one particular party opposed to Likud. A fourth puzzle is that the right is identified with security, but the security establishment identifies with the center-left. So you have leaders of the right, Netanyahu, Bennett, Lieberman, who profess that they can be entrusted with a nation's security. They ridicule the left, they ridicule the center left for being naive, unrealistic, endangering Israel's interests. Yet members of the security establishment shy away from these right-wing politicians, and their views are far more moderate and far more left or left of center. I mean, I'm referring here to former IDF chiefs of staff, former heads of military intelligence, former heads of the Shin Bet, the internal security services, former heads of the Mossad. The overwhelming majority of these figures are supporting the kind of ideas that are embraced by left of center figures. And in the last week alone, you had several prominent security figures like Amos Yadlin and Yoav Gallant and other former heads of the Mossad and Shin Bet and IDF military intelligence be very critical of Netanyahu for his approach towards the Palestinians, his approach towards Iran, and including his approach towards the United States, in particular his negative relationship with President Obama. Yet the public doesn't really seem to take notice, and so far the center left has failed to capitalize on this discrepancy, on this disconnect between the security people and the political right. And finally, the fifth puzzle is that Israel is becoming increasingly isolated, but most Israelis don't seem to take notice. So I mentioned a minute ago the relationship with the Obama administration is at an all-time low. The Palestinians have sunk into despair. Security cooperation with the PA is very minimal at this point and threatens to disappear altogether. Jordan recalled its ambassador for 3 months. Only now on Monday they're going to be returning their ambassador after that 3-month hiatus. And in Europe, one country after another is recognizing a Palestinian state despite the fervent opposition by the Netanyahu government. You've got Sweden, you've got France, you've got Britain. Basically, some of Israel's close allies in Europe are turning against Israel. And then, of course, you have the BDS movement, boycotts, divestment, sanctions movement, that threatens to also erode Israel's standing in the world. So these five phenomena put together, these puzzles put together, really help to explain why Netanyahu and his Likud party are in the lead as they head to next month's election. So now I return to the first puzzle, which is why some hawks become doves, which is really the focus of my research and my book. And what we see is epochal events around the world have taken place with hawks turning into doves. We have an example in Algeria in 1962 where President de Gaulle, a hardliner, turned towards a much more dovish policy by granting independence to Algeria. Nixon in China is, of course, an oft-used example that we have here in the States, where an anti-communist president turns towards China and opens the door to better diplomatic relations. The Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty of 1979 is, of course, a classic example where Anwar Sadat, who had initiated a war against Israel, the 1973 Yom Kippur War, 4 years later turns towards peace. And of course, the end of apartheid followed major reforms by Mandela, who repudiated violence prior to the end of apartheid. So the question I ask in my book is, why do some hawks become doves and other hawks remain hawks? And I think this is an important question both for theory and for policy. And in terms of IR theory, there's never really been a systematic systematic treatment of foreign policy change. And so I attempt to do that. It's also an important policy question, because if we can identify hawks from doves, then we might be able to come up with policies that could sway other leaders to opt for peace diplomacy. And finally, just a word about hawk and dove and what I mean by hawk and dove, because it's different in different contexts. In the Israeli political context, it refers to hardliner and softliner on the Palestinian question. So I use 4 criteria to distinguish a hawk from a dove. One is territorial compromise. Secondly, settlements in the occupied territories. Third, a leader's position on negotiations with the PLO. And finally, a leader's position on a Palestinian state. And what I do in my research is I apply insight from cognitive psychology to try to explain why it is that some people are more capable of changing their positions than others. When we look at mainstream international relations theory, such as rational choice approaches, realism and other rational choice approaches, the prediction is that a leader is going to adjust his or her policy, update his or her belief in accordance with changed circumstances. Things change on the ground, and therefore a leader is going to adjust accordingly. Yet we know from cognitive psychology that some people are more amenable to change than others. We also know that people are consistency seekers. They will look for bits and pieces of information that will confirm their beliefs, and they'll discard pieces of information that contradict their beliefs. And so only very few, relatively speaking, very few people are likely to change their core beliefs on various issues. And so I seek to explain who they are, how do I identify them, and what happens when they do change. And the two criteria I look at, the two terms that I use is cognitive openness and cognitive complexity. They're similar, they're related terms, they're taken from cognitive psychology, and they refer to how amenable a leader is to new information that challenges his or her core beliefs, how likely is he or she to incorporate that new information into his or her beliefs and change his or her beliefs accordingly. And complexity is the tendency of people to recognize people, events, situations in various shades of gray as opposed to black and white. And that defines the difference between a cognitively closed person, a cognitively simple person, and a cognitively complex person. So I choose to take a look at Shimon Peres. He's my main case study. I compare him to several other Israeli politicians, prime ministers, Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Shamir, Yitzhak Rabin, and I look at Netanyahu in my conclusion as well. But Peres is chosen because he is a paradigmatic case of a hawk who turned towards a dove. He was a hawk for many, many years throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and only at the late 70s, up until his present day, can one define him as a dove. And so there are many, many years here of information, of data that I've culled from archives, from memoirs, and from interviews with Peres and his associates, people who've known him for many years. And I look at three different phases of his career. The first phase is from 1953 to 1977. And this is the phase that I called his hawkish period. And this is a phase in which Peres supports counterterrorism operations, he displays hostile attitudes towards Arab leaders, and he dismisses dovish talk of any sort of peace or even compromise. I'm just quoting from something he said in 1955. Only if we demonstrate that we're a nation that has physical strength, military preparedness, military manpower to win or bend the Arabs in a war, and if we will have statesmen and leaders willing to use this strength, not for conquering, not for war, but to protect what we've attained, maybe that is the only way in which we can ensure peace that doesn't entail indefinite concessions. And so to that end, throughout the 1950s, Peres negotiates secret arms deals with the French, leading to a much stronger Israel. And in addition to the conventional arms, he also negotiates a nuclear plant, also built with the assistance of the French, turning Israel into a regional power. From 1966 to 1977, Peres, so this is after the Six-Day War, 1967, obviously a very important turning point in the Arab-Israeli conflict because Israel conquers the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem, as well as the Golan Heights from Syria. And Peres, during this period from 67 to 77, continues to oppose any sort of territorial compromise. He opposes PLO talks, he opposes Palestinian statehood, and he supports settlements. And in fact, as Rabin's defense minister in the 70s, he built some of the first Jewish settlements in the West Bank. On territorial compromise, he writes, "No compromise can satisfy the Arabs. It is the Arab goal to abolish Israel." And on the PLO, he says, the most moderate people in the PLO call for peace without Israel. So clearly, he has a very hawkish stance and even disagrees with many of his more dovish Labor Party colleagues, and I include Rabin, his arch rival within Labor, in that category. Now, the first dovish phase, there are two dovish phases that I describe in my book. The first one is from 1977 to 1987, and there are a couple of triggering events here that lead Peres to adopt more dovish policies. The first is that he becomes the chairman of the Labor Party, takes over from Yitzhak Rabin, and becomes the leader of the opposition. And the second turning point is, of course, Sadat's historic visit to Jerusalem, where he addresses the Israeli people in the Knesset. And these two events, one is domestic, political, the other one is obviously important, regional, international. These two events have a major impact on Peres' thinking. He becomes a supporter of territorial compromise. He becomes a lukewarm supporter, and in fact begins to oppose a lot of settlements in the West Bank, and he emerges as a major proponent of the peace process. Not yet on board with a Palestinian state, not yet on board with talks with the PLO, which he still defines, he still sees as a terrorist organization, but he supports territorial compromise, and he now wants to see a solution with Jordan, and he calls it the Jordanian option. From 1987 to 1997 is the second and final phase of his dovish term. And here there are a couple of what I'd call triggering events that lead him to adopt these more dovish policies. The first is that the Jordanian option is dead. So the first intifada breaks out. King Hussein of Jordan decides to wash his hands clean of the West Bank, severs all administrative and legal ties except for the Muslim holy places in Jerusalem, and there's no more possibility for a Jordanian solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And of course, the second important event is an event that Peres himself was very much involved in, and that's the Oslo Accords, the secret peace negotiations with the PLO. So when asked afterwards, later, why he changed his mind and why he agreed to negotiate with the PLO, an organization that for years he described as a terrorist organization, he said, "My preference is the agreement I reached with King Hussein in London. The minute that Shamir torpedoed it," Shamir was the prime minister under whom he served, "the choice was either not to negotiate with anybody or to negotiate with the Palestinians. Now the Palestinians, you have to make a choice between the PLO and Hamas. And I thought that the PLO is better, simple as that." And he ends up supporting a Palestinian state, which is the logical extension of the Oslo Peace Accords. So I identify his cognitive structure, his openness, and his complexity as kind of a key variable that explains why Peres, more so than others around him, were willing to change so dramatically their ideas, their beliefs on these very core existential questions. And what we see is, and this, I got this from dozens of interviews, people who knew him, including his rivals and opponents, we see somebody who's very open, somebody who's a good listener, somebody who is open to ideas and open to challenges, both internally and externally. He doesn't like to hire yes men. He has a history of hiring aides, assistants who are educated, young, educated, highly ambitious, and not afraid to challenge his ideas. People like Yossi Beilin and Uri Savir, who later on made news on their own because of achievements of their own. He's also influenced by writers, philosophers, intellectuals, and foreign leaders. He has dozens and dozens of meetings with the Socialist International, of which the Labor Party was part of, and he didn't necessarily agree with all these leaders on their stance towards the PLO and Palestinian statehood, but he absorbed what they had to say and he took what they had to say seriously. And Peres is also a very cognitively complex individual. Really sees things in nuances rather than black and white, not a very binary person. Lots of layers of complexity here, and is able to quickly reassess his views, including long-held views, in light of changing circumstances. Now, I compare him to three other prime ministers, Rabin, Begin, and Shamir, and I find Rabin to be moderately open and complex. He failed to consult with as many people as Shimon Peres did. He was not the greatest listener, but he was open to new information from the environment. When he read or came across new information, he did update his beliefs accordingly. And then I also look at Begin and Shamir. I call them the dogs that didn't bark, because they both are very cognitively closed, cognitively simple. They're disciples of Jabotinsky, Zev Jabotinsky, who's the head of, the leader of Zionist revisionist movement. And the Holocaust was a very recurring theme, especially for Begin. He would lecture world leaders about it. It was the lesson from history, an oft-used analogy, and would normally lecture world leaders about the Holocaust and compared everything to the Holocaust, and remained very ideologically rigid. And so despite the fact that he did end up withdrawing from the Sinai Peninsula in return for peace with Egypt, he never actually budged on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem, which he held very dear to his heart and part of this greater Israel that he advocated. Shamir was seen as the most cognitively closed and simple, even more so than Begin. He had a very narrow, undifferentiated worldview. Not a very good listener, showed little tolerance for criticism. Jewish critics were called self-haters, and in his opinion, Jews had no friends, and Jews had to constantly be on guard. And so, not surprisingly, he was called Mr. No by many people and refused to budge on any territorial issues. So, now, I want to just apply my findings to kind of more recent prime ministers, more recent leaders. One is Ariel Sharon, the former prime minister who died after years he was incapacitated because of a massive stroke, and so he died, I think, a year ago. Sharon was a lifelong, fierce opponent of a Palestinian state. In his autobiography, he wrote, "A Palestinian state has existed since 1922, when Great Britain split off 78% of Palestine to create Transjordan." In other words, Jordan was a Palestinian state as far as Sharon was concerned. But as prime minister, he dramatically changed his opinion. In December of 2002, he announced his support for a two-state solution at the annual Herzliya conference. And in 2003, he accepted President George Bush's roadmap, which is based on a two-state solution. And he even began to use a word that is foreign within right-wing circles and in the Likud party, and that word is occupation. He finally bolts from his Likud party that he helped to found, bolts from it in 2005, forms a new party, the centrist Kadima Party, and in the summer of 2005, he withdraws unilaterally from the entire Gaza Strip and 4 small settlements in the West Bank. So we see a major shift in Sharon, and we also see a major shift in Sharon's protege, Ehud Olmert, who also joins him in Kadima. Olmert, as a young, brash Likud politician, was so hawkish that he even opposed his own prime minister's Camp David Accords. So he voted against the Camp David Accords that Begin endorsed. He argued on the Palestinian issue that territorial compromise would be a disaster, and only after Sharon became prime minister and Olmert became his deputy, and Olmert eventually takes over when Sharon has a stroke, do we see a real change in Olmert's thinking. And in 2005, Olmert announces the existence of 2 nations, 1 Jewish and 1 Palestinian, is the full solution to the national aspirations and problems of each of the peoples. So he really came full circle here. And in terms of the Israeli elections and the country's future leadership today, I want to quote from Peres, who was asked what he thought about the current elections. Elections are taking place on March 17th. He said there are 2 camps, one for a 2-state solution and one for managing the crisis. And I think that that really accurately depicts the kind of divisions we're seeing today in the on the Israeli political map. Tzipi Livni, I mentioned her earlier. She was part of that Kadima party that Sharon and Olmert helped found. She's among the moderate, pragmatic, or was the more moderate, pragmatic Likud politicians who bolted the Likud party, is now running with the Labor Party, although she's not part of the Labor Party, but she's running on the same party list, and she's on board now, fully on board with a 2-state solution. and I want to say a few words about Netanyahu, since you're probably interested in hearing my take on him. I see him as a more cognitively closed and simple person, and therefore less likely to change his opinion. And I say this for a couple of reasons, and I had a chance to interview some of his former aides. I was told there are a couple things about him that he really prizes. One is personal loyalty. So whenever he hires somebody, wants to make sure that that person is loyal to him personally. And the second thing is Likud party affiliation. So in other words, he's really surrounded primarily by people of his worldview. And the range of voices that he ends up hearing is therefore quite limited. Just last week, former Mossad chief Meir Dagan noted that when he served under Sharon, he was able to express his differences with Sharon, and Sharon welcomed, even if he disagreed, those different opinions. But with Netanyahu, Netanyahu did not want to fathom any kind of disagreement and reminded him that he was a subordinate and was not interested in his point of view. So we see a kind of a very different attitude with Netanyahu. Also, like the other ones, a lifelong opponent of a Palestinian state. In his 1993 book, he writes, such a state would nullify the whole value of the buffer area in Israel's Eastern Front, and a two-state solution to resolve a conflict between two peoples is Jordan. So he writes this in his 1993 book. But even as late as 2009, after being elected prime minister the second time, he continued to oppose a Palestinian state. And it was only that June of 2009 where he endorsed a Palestinian state. But I see that as more of a tactical response to pressure from the White House rather than any kind of change in worldview. And indeed, we have not seen much movement on that front since he was elected. We've seen unprecedented construction of homes, of settlements in the West Bank. And each of Netanyahu's coalitions has been decidedly right-wing, with the majority of cabinet members opposed to a two-state solution. His own Likud party, to this very day, remains opposed to a two-state solution, and the Likud platform, try to Google it, it is not publicly available, so we don't know exactly what's in there. I want to conclude with a few notes about the elections, about the upcoming elections. Barring either a major unexpected event or a significant development into the corruption allegations that have been plaguing the Netanyahu household as of late, I expect that the Likud party will prevail in the upcoming elections and that Netanyahu will form the next government. I do not expect him to push for a two-state solution. And one of the big questions here is what the Obama administration plans to do. Given that there are some major foreign policy issues that are, confronting the administration now, from defeating ISIS to the Iran talks, to the crisis in Ukraine, which threatens to spill over into a bigger crisis with the Russians. I'm not sure that President Obama wants to focus on this issue. And moreover, given his really bad history with Netanyahu personally, and the fact that he's going to vacate the White House in a couple years, and we're going to start to see the new campaign season come up here in our country, I would be surprised if he makes this a priority in his remaining months or years in office. So what we're left with is kind of a lack of leadership when it comes to peace diplomacy for now. And but I don't want to conclude on that note. I want to conclude on a slightly more optimistic or hopeful note, and that is that one possible outcome here, I think, in this election will be the formation of something that Israelis haven't seen in a while, and that is a real opposition. There's a real opportunity now that with Herzog and Livni teaming up together, these two parties joining forces, a lot of momentum has been generated, and even if they don't win, and again, I don't expect them to win, he and his new partner have the potential to create an actual opposition to Prime Minister Netanyahu, which could affect the way that Israelis see some of these issues. Another possibility that I think we might see is Arab League involvement in a very positive way. Of course, there was the old Arab Peace Initiative, but given what the region has been experiencing as of late with fanatical terrorists, with militants that are really shaking things up, I would not be surprised if even the Netanyahu government is able to work with the Arab League and with some of these Arab states and perhaps create some sort of new regional framework for peace. And finally, there is the phenomenon that I've written about and that I research, and that's the hawk to dove phenomenon. And so it is not inconceivable. I wouldn't hold my breath, but it is not inconceivable that anybody, including Netanyahu, might experience that shift in the next term. So I'll end with that, and I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you. Before I take questions, just a word here. This is Laura Cutler from Center for Israel Studies and Eric Fillinger from USIP, from U.S. Foreign Policy Program. They really worked a lot on this event, and I know I thanked you briefly, but if anybody has questions about programming, you can talk to Michael Brenner and Laura Cutler after the program, and I'm sure they'll provide you with information about other events that they have this year.
And if anyone is standing in the back, there are a couple of open seats here if you want to come grab a seat.
Thank you very much. Thanks for those comments, Mike Kurtzig. Would you comment on Peres's ideas or Peres's position on the Zionist dream? The fact that Israel is now very much polarized between a very large population that's below the poverty level and another one, like my brother, was quite wealthy, and other people of his class quite wealthy, and the middle class, which is having a very difficult time economically, and you mentioned economics. Of course, Peres was very close to Ben-Gurion and came up with Ben-Gurion, and I think they had a different idea of what Israel would be like today. Would you comment on what he thinks about what's going on in the country right now?
Sure. I mean, Peres has indicated on a number of occasions that he's concerned with the growing gap between the well-to-do and the haves and the have-nots. He's used the term swinish capitalism quite a few times to describe some of the current government's approach. He did that more before he became president, obviously, than while he was president. But it is a concern of his. He's talked about the poverty and how it does threaten the social fabric of Israeli society. But you mentioned Ben-Gurion, and you asked me about his vision, and his vision is still very much tied to his mentor. Peres was Ben-Gurion's protege, and I think a great example of this is his most recent book that he co-authored with the late David Landau, who just passed away 2 or 3 days ago. And in his book, he talks about Ben-Gurion and describes Ben-Gurion as a visionary, and one kind of theme that comes up again and again is he gives credit to Ben-Gurion for the most important decision that Ben-Gurion made, and that important decision is the idea of partition. That Ben-Gurion was able to, despite a lot of internal opposition and despite his own hesitation, was able to accept the partition between Israel and Palestine. And he wrote this while he was president, and so I think that what he was trying to say was what's needed today is kind of a visionary who understands that a partition between Israel and Palestine is critical for the future of the country.
Thank you. Lee Gotchman, School of Public Affairs, Senior. We spoke a lot about the election coming up, the Israeli election, but on the Palestinian side, Abu Mazen Mahmoud Abbas is getting older, and he's been serving in his post as president for quite some time. With your discussion on hawks and doves, could we foresee another element, maybe another dynamic factor coming in if Abbas steps down and another Palestinian leader who I guess none of us know would be taking his post?
So one of the big problems right now when we talk about resuming the peace process, and any Israeli, including those in the center or those on the left, will ask you is who are you going to negotiate with? Because you have a very fractured Palestinian society. You have Hamas that's in control of Gaza. You have the ailing and aging Mahmoud Abbas, who's sort of in control of the West Bank. He's not going to be around for much longer, as you point out. And so that really raises a lot of questions about his successor. We know that they've been talking about holding elections, Palestinian elections for a while, presidential elections for a while. According to all the recent polls, especially since the Gaza war, Hamas would prevail in the election. Somebody like Haniya would prevail in the elections. So this, of course, raises alarm bells in Israel. And it's not clear who would replace Abbas in terms of within his own Fatah organization. Israel has one big card they've been holding for a while, and that's Barghouti, who, according to polls, would defeat anybody else. But Barghouti would not. Barghouti is in Israeli prisons. He was one of the ringleaders of the second Intifada, and led to the deaths of many Israeli civilians. But it is far from clear that he would be the one who A, is released, and B, would take over and pursue any kind of peace agreement with Israel. So I think there's a real vacuum in leadership all around, not just in Israel, but in among the Palestinians as well, for sure.
Professor, my question is, if it weren't for the fact that Israel was surrounded by the belligerent nation states, do you think it would still have the major right-wing support that it does, mainly because of other issues that could pertain to, like, the economy and social issues?
I mean, that's a hypothetical situation, and Israel's been, seen as Israelis view themselves as isolated from the rest of the world, essentially. And when it comes to the Arab world, they see an Arab world that wants its destruction, that seeks its destruction, even though you now have some friendly relations between Israel and Egypt, Israel and Jordan, and then even Israel and Morocco and some other countries, despite the fact they don't have a formal peace agreement. You would have to have dramatic changes in the Middle East to comfort Israelis. And I think that when it comes to the Palestinians, they're concerned with this there's this narrative in Israel where there's nobody to talk to, there's no partner. And this is a narrative that a lot of Israelis have bought into, not just Netanyahu supporters, although Netanyahu is has championed this narrative. So it's very complicated, but no, I do not think we're going to see a change anytime soon on that front.
I'm Jake Blumenstock. I'm a SBA student. I'm a freshman. I have a question about the upcoming elections. There's been some talks about the possibility of the Palestinian camp possibly being in a coalition with the Zionist camp. If that were to happen, do you think that Kulanu would then join with the Zionist camp and form a very slim majority for the Zionists over Likud and Jewish Home and the far right like Shas?
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, stay with the microphone there, because if I understand you correctly, you're saying the Arab parties, you're talking about the United Arab list now?
Yes. That
they would join forces with whom? With
the Zionist camp. If there's a possibility of that, do you think Kulanu would then join with the Zionist camp?
Well, first of all, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think there's a possibility that they're going to join forces. Certainly not formally. They would conceivably back up the Zionist camp. If the Zionist camp prevailed in the elections, then they would back them up from outside the coalition. But that's not a realistic scenario regardless, because I don't think the Zionist camp is going to prevail, and I don't think the Zionist camp would be able. Zionist camp, by the way, is the center-left Labor-Livni alliance I alluded to earlier. I don't think that they're going to be able to form any kind of center-left coalition. That's not in the cards. So, and Kulanu is a new party. It's a center-right party, and it's not exactly clear at this point who they would go with. They'd probably go with either party, Netanyahu or his opposition. But I don't see that as a realistic scenario.
Hi, Garrett Martin, SAS faculty. Well, you mentioned, you talked about psychological profiles being cognitively open or closed, and you also then mentioned that people tend to be consistency seekers. So when you're looking at the profiles of those who have made that transition from being hawks to doves, is it because they don't value consistency as much, or are they better able to rationalize the changes, to sort of integrate them within a larger, consistent narrative? And as a speculation, since the elections are on St. Patrick's Day, considering Herzog's Irish origins, could that be a good omen?
Okay, great question by my colleague. I would say it's the latter. People are consistency seekers in general, but there are some who are able to, despite all odds, take new information that contradicts their beliefs and adjust their ideas accordingly. So in this case, I mean, I look at Shimon Peres as the paradigmatic case of this, and I'm sure there are others as well, but that's not the norm. That's not the norm. And the idea is people who are more amenable to new information, who do change their beliefs, are therefore able to take new circumstances and adjust their beliefs accordingly based on these new circumstances. But you have, in a couple of these instances that I cover in my book, you have, like the first Intifada, for example, there were several major events in the late 1980s and early 1990s that really shook things up in the Middle East, okay, on the Arab-Israeli front. You have the Intifada, the first Intifada, Palestinian Intifada. You have the collapse of the Soviet Union, and you have the Persian Gulf War. And as a result of the Persian Gulf War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, you have a PLO that's financially bankrupt and that's isolated, because the PLO chose to go with Saddam Hussein's Iraq. They made the wrong choice, and they paid a very heavy price. So Peres was able to kind of see that. Peres and Rabin were able to see these events as, as game changers, and essentially decided to adopt a very different idea, a very different policy towards the Palestinians than they did before. Whereas for Shamir and other right-wing hardliners, the lesson was, well, now that you have a weak PLO, why rescue them? Why sign an agreement with them or try to negotiate with them? So you can have two people who witness the same exact events and who come to very different conclusions. And so this is where I think agency comes in and shows you that people can make a difference, that decision makers themselves can make a difference.
Hi, I'm Alex Hart. I'm a junior in SIS, and my question had to do with your discussion of what is upcoming in the elections with Netanyahu potentially winning, and that is, if he is, in your opinion, considered a hawk, and that mindset isn't going to change anytime soon, what would the Palestinian question look like with his new government? How would he go about dealing with issues in the West Bank and Gaza, given that he does not consider the two-state solution a viable one?
You're talking about Netanyahu, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so as I was saying, I mean, I think what we're going to see is Netanyahu reelected, and he will likely pursue the same thing he's been pursuing, which is managing the conflict. The reason I'm not as pessimistic on the Palestinian front is because of the other possibilities that we may see that are more likely after the elections than are now. One is, I mentioned the Arab League and the possibility that there could be some, there are new alliances that are being formed right now. Alliances that would have been inconceivable even a year or two ago, okay? Saudi Arabia and Israel, for example, working very closely together on a number of fronts. And so that could be a moment, defining moment for Netanyahu to actually take an initiative, something that he doesn't normally do. He's very risk-averse, doesn't take the initiative. This could help lead to an initiative. And the second thing is a real opposition. So in a parliamentary democracy, things move when you have a real opposition. And up until now, you haven't had a real opposition in many, many years, because you have a weak and divided, you've had a weak and divided Labor Party. A lot of the parties that could have been in the opposition were actually part of the government, trying to influence things from within. So if you actually have an opposition, a strong opposition, you can move things from internally. I'm sorry, you can move things within Israeli society and put pressure on the government to act.
Guy?
Oh, please, Phil.
Philip Brenner. In SIS. This has been a magnificent talk and very clear and concise, and thank you very much for writing the book and making this presentation. I'm struck by how little you've talked about religion, given that Israel is a Jewish state. And I wonder what role the increasing movement towards making it more of a, not just a state for Jews, but a Jewish state has on the politics in Israel? And what would Shimon Peres say about this?
So Shimon Peres has often said that, politics is the art of the compromise, whereas religion is not. So the religious factor is a very, very complicated factor. It's a very dangerous factor. And it's a factor that one can even argue Netanyahu has included by making this demand. Now, this demand that the Palestinians recognize Israel as a Jewish state is a relatively new demand. All right, this demand was not made of Egypt when Begin signed a peace treaty with Sadat. It was not made of King Hussein of Jordan when Israel signed a peace treaty with King Hussein in 1994, nor was it made of the Palestinians in all the previous negotiations, including Oslo and since Oslo. So it's a relatively new demand, and it's one that is not going to be met. And the reason it's not going to be met is because you have an Arab minority within Israel that will not accept it. And no Palestinian leader is going to try to undermine an Arab minority within Israel and accept it. So I think it's kind of, I think it's unnecessary as well, as other Israelis have pointed out, as Israeli politicians have pointed out. It's not a necessary thing. You don't need the other side. You can call yourself what you want to call yourself. You don't need the other side to define your own nation or your own country for you. So that's where I think religion fits in. And then, of course, we've seen recent outbreaks in the Temple Mount area last fall. Right? There were a couple weeks where things were extraordinarily tense. Not because of Netanyahu necessarily or his government, but you have very religious, I would say, right-wing religious elements who believe that Jews have a right to pray on the Temple Mount and are trying to change the status quo. And that's a very dangerous thing. And Netanyahu, to his credit, said, I refuse to change the status quo. Jews will not be allowed to pray on the Temple Mount. But there is pressure. There's pressure from these right-wing religious elements to do so. And of course, we're seeing religion on the Palestinian side as well, with Hamas and other groups. So it is a very, very important factor, and I certainly didn't mean to dismiss it, but it's one that I think most politicians are going to try to keep under wraps, whether we're talking about Netanyahu or Abbas.
Yeah, right here. Hi, my name is Daron. I'm on the board of J Street U here at American. I'd like you to comment on Bibi's upcoming speech to Congress and its invitation from the Republican Party, and how that will affect domestic issues here in America in relations to dealing with Iran, and also how it'll affect the upcoming Israeli elections.
Okay, so just to kind of summarize here what Doron is talking about, there was an invitation by Boehner to Netanyahu to address Congress joint session. This would be the third time Netanyahu addresses a joint session of Congress, and as Netanyahu's people like to point out, the last time this happened was Winston Churchill, and so it's a big deal for Netanyahu. But this was really a cynical ploy. This was done to undermine President Obama. Some have called this Boehner's response to the State of the Union address, or second response to the State of the Union address. It is another instance, and perhaps the ugliest instance to date, of using Israel and Iran, for that matter, as a political football, a partisan political football. And Netanyahu kind of agreed to do so. I thought it was a big mistake, and he may pay a big price for doing so. Although right before this talk began, I was looking on my Twitter feed, and there were reports that Netanyahu is planning on canceling or postponing that visit, and that would obviously solve that dilemma. But if he does end up addressing, Congress 2 weeks before the election, I think it's going to cost him a lot of support here among Democrats, some of whom already said they're not going to attend his speech.
Howard Wachtel, could you comment on the Palestinian Authority's strategy to use the UN for recognition, including their impending in the next couple of years taking, if they get through that, taking Israel to the International Criminal Court?
So the Palestinians are desperate, and they're going to use some desperate measures. To Abbas's credit, violence is not one of those options for him. As far as Abbas is concerned, violence, a new intifada, a third intifada, or kind of a more violent response is not in the cards. But he has to do something, because the people are feeling desperate. And so this is his way of showing his people that his nation, that he is trying to promote their interest. I think that you have to look at this collectively in terms of the damage it does to Israel, or the effect that it does to Israel. This is one of many pieces. I mentioned some earlier, the BDS movement, the recognition by various European parliaments of supporting, new status for the Palestinians. But in terms of the ICC, that's something that Abbas himself has to be wary of, because a lot of Palestinians could be implicated if Israel were to go to the ICC with similar complaints about Palestinian violations. So I don't see that on the horizon anytime soon. But these threats are, as I said, they're kind of they're there to for domestic purposes primarily. I don't think they're going to lead to any dramatic change overnight.
So I think maybe, Noah Arbit. I think maybe half of the people in the room already know what I'm going to ask, but here.
Where are you? I don't even see. Oh, okay.
Nice to finally meet you in the flesh. So let's talk about Tzippi. So we know that she was born into a very, revisionist right-wing family. Her parents were, senior commanders in the Irgun, and she was brought up, with the idea of Greater Israel being important. She was in Beitar, and now it's the 20th anniversary of her entering politics. Yes, everyone can clap. And she joined first with Likud and was a Knesset member for Likud until 2005, and then joined Kendima. But so she's become a leading voice for peace. But in terms of being a hawk versus a dove, I think a lot of people have branded her as a dove, but arguably, she has maintained a lot of her, hawkishness. Of course, she's abandoned, the Greater Israel ideal,
Sure.
for peace. But she was cast lead and everything when she was foreign minister. But now she was chief negotiator. What do you think in terms of her psychology? How do you see, since she isn't either way? And secondly, if they do form a government, do you think that they have toned down their rhetoric about peace, she and Herzog? But do you think that they will be able to achieve a peace treaty?
So first of all, thank you for that biography. That was a great biography, and you should be her official biographer, I think. I would respond to that by saying, look, I haven't studied Tzippi Livni, so I cannot comment on her. I haven't interviewed people who've worked with her. I can't comment on her cognitive structure, whether she's open, I'm not qualified to answer that question. She seems like she's more open, but she also seems like she is a good politician. This is, as you know, the fourth party that she's moved to within several years, and she's not an ideologue. That's for sure. She's not an ideologue, but she did grow up, as you point out, in Beitar, in these right-wing circles. She's definitely come a long way, and so I definitely place her in the category of hawks turned doves. But I don't know exactly the extent to which she will go. My criticism of her is a criticism shared by many Israelis, and I suspect you might disagree with this. I don't see her as much of a leader. She was a leader of her party, but she failed, and I don't see her leading a new effort. And I hope I'm proven wrong in the years ahead. And maybe she, together with Herzog, will together form this kind of leadership that we haven't seen in a while in the opposition. But so far, I haven't seen much leadership from her over the years. And we can discuss that later, though.
Hello, my name is Naomi Nairman. I'm originally a Sabra, and I'm living here in Washington area. I have a question about what you see in Israeli opinion about the current administration and the future elections in this country.
Okay, I was just talking with somebody about that right before this event. I don't think most Israelis are in tune with American politics. They don't really understand it. They don't really understand the nuances or the differences between Democrats and Republicans. They don't understand maybe now they're beginning to understand the potential damage that a Netanyahu speech will cause here, but they really don't focus on that. And one would think that after the very negative publicity that Netanyahu got, the very negative press he got for last couple of weeks, that he would pay a political price for it, because the one thing Israelis value above anything else is a strong U.S.-Israel relationship. They don't care that much about Europe or the rest of the world, but the United States they hold very near and dear. Yet he didn't, and all the recent polls show that if anything, he went up in the polls. I don't think it was necessarily because of this, but I don't think that what happens here really resonates over there.
And for you students, Professor Ziv teaches a course on U.S.-Israel relations, so you could have a whole semester of that next semester, and his classes are always waitlisted, so sign up early.
Hi, I'm Mackenzie Ferdinand. I'm a sophomore in CAS. You spoke earlier about many Israelis worrying about the current socioeconomic situation in Israel, and I was wondering if you could comment on the growing Haredi population and whether that will force the new government that comes into power to look more closely at the economic troubles, to say the least, that are occurring.
So the Haredi population, she's referring to the ultra-Orthodox segment of Israeli society. It's not clear what's going to happen with the next government, because it all depends on whether or not they're part or not part of the government. I believe that they will be part of the next government. They are the natural, traditional allies of Netanyahu, and it was actually a fluke that they were not part of the current government. So I think there's a high likelihood that they will join the next government, most likely led by Netanyahu, in which case there would be pressure internally to pursue the kind of policies that you were talking about, kind of more socially liberal policies. Plus, you have a Likud renegade. Somebody mentioned Kulanu earlier. I think you asked me about Kulanu earlier. Kulanu is also a new party that is headed by Moshe Kahlon, a former minister in Netanyahu's government. He's a populist and somebody who's very much, even though he's kind of a hawk on socioeconomic issues, he's very social democratic, very left on that, or center left on that. And I think that if he joins the government, and he's a likely coalition partner, there will be more pressure on the government to focus more on those issues. So that I see happening. Should we take, how many more questions should we take, Eric? What do you think?
How many are
We've got a little time. Okay, maybe 3 more, 4 more?
Sure.
Okay. Okay, sounds good. Okay, all right. So 4 more questions. Who's going next?
Hi, Professor Ziv.
Okay.
I'm Bradley. I'm a senior in SIS. I guess, so it kind of sounds like what you're saying is, barring extreme circumstances, Netanyahu is going to be leading the next Israeli government. Right now, to sort of understate it a little bit, U.S.-Israel relations between the president and Bibi are not fantastic. And it seems that, recent events have only made this a lot worse. Do you see any scenario in which, once the 2016 elections happen here and a new president comes into the White House, there's going to be any continued fallout from the current state of U.S.-Israel relations?
No, because a lot of it is personal. I mean, so there are some policy differences for sure, but much of it is also personal. There's bad blood between Netanyahu and Obama that does not necessarily extend to other aspects of the U.S.-Israel relationship, which remain very strong. For example, the defense assistance that the United States gives Israel has been even stronger under Obama than under his predecessors. So I think that we're really talking about the personal relationship. And if Netanyahu goes ahead with the speech, which now I'm not sure he will, that could do a little bit damage to his relationship with Democrats. Much of it is also Netanyahu. I mean, Netanyahu kind of has a history of working better with Republicans than with Democrats. You know, he interfered in our elections here in 2012 when one of his top aides brought Romney to Israel, and that top aide, Ron Dermer, is today the ambassador to Washington. So Netanyahu has a history of this. Even during the Clinton administration, we had very friendly president towards Israel here, as is Obama, but Bill Clinton was seen as even more friendly. He undermined, Bill Clinton by meeting with Jerry Falwell and the leaders of the Christian coalition prior to his meeting with Clinton during the height of the impeachment scandal and the scandals that engulfed the White House. So, and this is something that I don't think Bill Clinton easily forgave him for. So there's kind of a history of this, and I think after the most recent episodes, I'm not sure we're going to see it get worse in the foreseeable future. It also depends who are the candidates here, who gets elected. But I think a lot of it is based on whether it's a Democrat or Republican. Obviously, I don't have the answer to that.
Oh, hi, I'm DJ Hamburger. I'm a senior at SAS. I'm just curious, when researching for your book, Why Hawks Become Doves, did you come across any doves that became hawks in the reverse?
Yeah, so that's actually a very good question, and I write about one, and that is Jimmy Carter, because, Jimmy Carter is not a hawk, but when he became president, he took a very dovish stance towards the Soviet Union. Very dovish stance towards the Soviet Union, was much closer in his position on the Soviets to Vance, Secretary Cy Vance was Secretary of State, as opposed to Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was his NSC advisor and took a very hard line towards the Soviets. And there were several kind of back-to-back events, including the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and some other important turning points that led Carter to revise his stance, adopt Brzezinski's much harder line, and really kind of emerged as this new hawk, towards the second part of his term. So, so he would be one example, but clearly I think there are more examples of hawks who become doves than doves who become hawks. You also have there's one politician in Israel, a very prominent politician, Steinitz, who's a Likud party minister. Yuval Steinitz used to be affiliated with Peace Now many years ago. So he would be another example of a dove who became a hawk within the Israeli political context. But again, that's more of an exception to the rule.
Hi, Professor Ziv. My name is Benji Mandel. I'm an alumni of American University and former graduate student at Tel Aviv University. My question is, you said that one good thing that could come from this election is a solid leftist opposition bloc. Last time I checked the polls, my favorite party, Meretz, was barely hanging on, barely making the threshold. What do you entail this leftist bloc consisting of, and what do you see for Meretz's future? If it doesn't meet the threshold, will it dissolve?
So the problem, as I see it, is I've talked about surveys and polls that show that the socioeconomic issues are what really drives Israelis nowadays. Like, this is what they're thinking about. This is what they're fearful of. They're worried about the price of housing, right? They're worried about the costs of cottage cheese and other household products. And this actually concerns them more nowadays than the traditional peace and security issues. All the polls bear that out. So as a result, what the center left has done, and what the center left has done, is all but ignore the political security issue, because they haven't wanted to alienate voters. So as a result, there's no real leadership on this issue, except maybe from Meretz. But Meretz is a left-wing party, defines itself as a left-wing party, and most Israelis won't even give them a chance because most Israelis don't identify with the left. So that message that you might be hearing from Meretz has to be articulated by the likes of Tzipi Livni and Herzog and others in the political center. And until that happens, I don't think you're going to have a real shift in the political dynamics.
Professor Ziv. Adi Palidi, SIS alumni, and also a graduate of your SIS Abroad program to Israel. I want to thank Benji for helping lead into my question. He mentioned the threshold.
Yeah.
Israel is a wonderful, vibrant democracy, experiment in democracy that's continuously evolving. We've seen in the past the experiment with direct election of prime ministers, which has since been repealed. This year, the experiment is raising the threshold. How is that impacting the pending elections coming up next month? I know one that I think we've all seen are these coalitions, these pre-election coalitions, partnerships that are being built. Are there other ramifications that we in America don't have access to, aren't fully aware of?
Sure. So Israel, being a parliamentary democracy, has lots of parties. It's a pluralistic society. You have a pluralistic political map. And one of the major problems, though, is that the structure of the electoral system has prevented prime minister after prime minister from having these kind of stable coalition governments where they can do what they want to do. So the idea is, if you raise the electoral threshold, which they did, you would have fewer smaller niche parties, and kind of big, you would have more representation among the bigger parties, and then more can get done. So that's the idea behind it. The first immediate victim of this appeared to be the Arab parties, because you had three Arab parties. You have three Arab parties who have different agendas, and for a lot of reasons, including ego, they were never united, and so they were on the verge of disappearing, which obviously, for democratic reasons, would be a disaster. And so this really forced them to unite. And what's interesting is that all the polls that are coming out show that with a united Arab list, you have even stronger representation among Arabs. So this could influence things if more Arabs vote in Israel, and if they vote for this Arab list, then you can have a pretty powerful voice. But it can also hurt other parties, such as Benji was mentioning Meretz, which is the kind of the left, the leftist party that is now on the verge of disappearance. It's right on the border there, and so it could be problematic for some of the smaller parties. Should we take one more and that's it? Or okay.
Thank you, Dr. Ziv, for this wonderful discussion. I know that we've all enjoyed it. I have a two-part question. I know that you were really trying to end on a positive note regarding the peace process, and I know we all appreciate that. But I was wondering what your views on the viability of the Jewish nationality bill would be in the new Knesset. And you talked about how even if Netanyahu wins, there's still a really strong coalition, opposition coalition, that maybe would prevent that. But if it were to pass, what does that mean for the Arab minority in Israel, and what does that mean for the peace process?
Yeah, I'm not overly concerned with that bill. There have been a slew of these nationalistic bills. And again, to Netanyahu's credit, he actually hasn't supported all of them, and he's actually kind of put the kibosh on a few of them. So what you're seeing now is mostly done for election purposes, campaign purposes. I think that the one kind of positive thing I have to say about Netanyahu and his leadership is that he tends to be more risk averse, which is bad for the peace process in terms of taking an initiative, but it's good in the sense of preventing anything dramatic, anything drastic in a harmful sense from taking place. So I would be surprised if he lent his hand to the passage of some of these very controversial bills that will not necessarily make it through to the end. I could be wrong, but that would be.
Didn't he initiate that?
But again, some of what he had initiated were done for domestic political purposes. He's often driven by domestic politics, but there were amendments to what he did and other versions of what he did that were more extreme. And I think most of the attention and concern was focused on those more extreme versions, not in his initial version. And you could always change it later too. So again, I'm not, I was alarmed when I saw some of these things. I don't necessarily expect all these things to pass in the final readings. I think he's going to hopefully be more responsible than that.